Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at. This is the Cribl User Group meeting. I am Shawn. I'm Roll Tide GA on Slack, if you see me out there. And that's kind of where the Alabama shirt comes from, Roll Tide. So I'm filling in for Rich this week, just to be the host of the MC of this meeting. And let's just, without further ado, let's just get started. With Eugene, you're going to talk about reference architectures for Cribl Stream.
Yep, that's the plan. So let me share my screen and dive into it. That looks like the right screen. Awesome. So yeah, I'm Eugene Katz. I was just as catching up with Shawn, realizing that almost exactly 2 years ago, plus or minus a month, I was introducing him because I was the user group leader then, and he was talking about syslog at the user group. So, but now I'm with Cribl and doing professional services. And one of the things that I was working on is the reference architectures and just architectural considerations, which I'll be talking about today until somebody stops me. So let's dive right into it. As soon as I get on the right screen. So real quick, obviously you're not going to be reading this, but what we're talking about there on the left in navigation is under the deployment stream software, a couple of extra items came out. One of is architectural considerations, which is this document that you're seeing and the main focus of this talk, but also very fresh off the presses are some actual reference architectures and diagrams, which will also take part in this presentation. So if you want to find the things that I'm talking about, go to the docs and look on the left under deployment, and then planning and sizing. So as I mentioned, mostly we're going to be talking about parts of the architectural considerations document, but also like literally as of last night, this new section of reference architectures has been published out to the docs page. So we're going to focus on few different parts of it and use the reference architectures as talking points as we go through. First, I want to say this is a team effort. So I was working on it, but really, I was taking kind of lead on writing things down, but a lot of it was asking questions of experts inside of Cribl, figuring out what are the different, parts of the sizing that mean really under the covers to be able to go in depth and give those recommendations, and really in a lot of cases, just things to think about as part of that document. So it's definitely a team effort, but I was asking a lot of questions in Slack and elsewhere to find out what really makes sense to put down for people to use as guidance. And the reference architectures were actually Ahmed put together, and we'll see them as well. The subtitle of It Depends has a history, because as I said, I was digging in and finding out, okay, well, what's this number mean? Where did we get this number? How strict is that particular piece of guidance? The feedback was, it depends, at which point I said, okay, well, I guess I'm done. That's it. That's the document. It depends. But really, as silly as that answer is and as annoying it can get, it does depend. And the point of the document, which obviously I'm not going to be going through the whole thing, but I'll bring out some highlights, is to talk about what does it depend on and what things to consider as you're figuring out your own particular deployment. And feel free to jump in with questions at any time. If something doesn't make sense, if something needs a little more explanation, I'm happy to stop and dive in. So it's not exactly in the order that's presented, but it made sense to talk about things that are kind of easier to think about initially. right? So one of the sections talks about how many worker nodes. The text on here is pretty much from the document with some highlighting. But the first thing to think about when you're sizing your deployment is the fact that you're going to have one worker that you want to be able to have down either for maintenance or whatever else is happening with with that particular machine. You want to be able to run at n-1. And we talk about that, but really digging into the numbers here, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but this is something that resonated. I was talking to people during my professional service engagements and so on. Really kind of the picture here also helps you think about, you can have a couple of workers, really big workers, but what's the effect of that? And really, if you look at your the diagram of two big workers nodes with 30 worker processes per node, when one of them is down, you're down to 30 worker processes, right? Big machines, but few of them, that's the downside. And as I mentioned at the top right, we're looking at approximately similar throughput of 5.6 to 6 terabytes per day for each one of those configurations. So the second configuration that I go into the math of is with 3 worker nodes, right? 16 vCPUs per machine, which some of you are more familiar, some of you are less familiar with it, but 2 vCPUs are reserved by default for system, for the API process. So they're not processing the data, they're just reserved for managing the system. So that's why the -2 vCPUs per node for overhead is in there. And yeah, that means you have smaller nodes, so the percentage of what's available is less per node. But with 3 worker nodes, for example, now you have, when one is down, that means you're down 14 worker processes, not 30 as in the previous case, right? So you're 1/3 down. And then 6 worker nodes, obviously, the more worker nodes you have, the less you lose when one is down in terms of capacity. But because of that 2 vCPUs being reserved for overhead, you're now going to lose always that many vCPUs per node. So somewhere the graph inverts. It's not necessarily here, because then I go through and calculate, how many terabytes per vCPU you are effectively processing. And that's the point of this illustration, is that you can start playing with the math, looking for yourself, looking at the cost of each of the machines, whether you're getting them provisioned in the cloud or on-prem, right? What makes sense for you? And that's part of how we start answering the question, the it depends. So there's no specific recommendation of this is what you should do. There are a lot of things you want to consider. I'm going to pause to breathe and ask if there are any questions on any of that so far. All righty. So the other thing to talk about is throughput variability, right? And this is actually from a real deployment where there's data coming in, right? And we talk about, the general guidance, right? If I flip back a couple of slides right there on the left, that says, well, the general guidance is, you have one physical core, 400 gigabytes in plus out. Okay, great. So we look at, 400 gigabytes per day in plus out. So in this case, we're using vCPUs, so it's 200 gigabytes per day in plus out. So something like 51 gigabytes per day in, assuming the same out, right? Assuming we're outputting 1-to-1, which is not always the case. Sometimes you might be writing something to, an object store for full fidelity and then reduced to another destination. But for simplicity's sake, this is what we're looking at here. and to 102 gigabytes per day. So really kind of one vCPU should be enough, right? And the node there on the bottom is right 200 gigabytes per day in and out per vCPU. I mean, that looks fine, but of course it doesn't. Because if we start looking into it, and the document kind of digs into more and more details on this, if we look at the peak here, right, and this is a peak, not doubling or tripling of what happens right before it or after it, but just a spike. Now we see it's actually 1.4 megabytes per second, which changes the math a little bit, right? So now if we take 1.4 megabytes per second, multiply that out to gigabytes per day, we get 121, not 51 anymore, right? And once we multiply that by 2 effectively to get in plus out, now it's 243 gigabytes per day. So 2 vCPUs, okay, fine. These are not large numbers, but it illustrates the point. However, we're not done, because if you then look at, and this is the same exact input, real world input, if you look at it, it's actually, and it's Office 365 activity, it pulls periodically, which means you don't have this consistent line of throughput, you have these spikes. So once I zoom into, I believe this was 1 hour, now you see that it's really actually 3 1/3 ish megabytes per second. So multiplying that math out, we realize that it's about more than 5 times our original gigabytes per day estimate, right? So we went from, just to flip back, right, from just looking at it at a days lens, zooming in further, we looked at the spikes, and then we looked at what's the actual behavior of this particular source. And that's one of the challenges, because as you're planning your architecture, you're not going to have all these answers. So you're going to make some decisions, make some best guesses, and then once you start pulling the sources, some things, they'll average out, it won't really matter so much. But other things you'll discover as you go that you have, this type of spiky data, or whatever the case is, or, everybody comes in, if you have Windows events that are on people's laptops, and they come in and plug in Monday morning, all of a sudden everybody's laptops are sending data, and now you have this huge spike that you don't normally have. So other cases where you might want to consider are if you have seasonal things like Black Friday sales for e-commerce or whatever the case is. So really going back, right, you start with something, but then you have to think through all the different contributing factors to what might happen normally in terms of spikes in your data, and what's the real throughput needs to be. But then at some point, you're going to hit an unexpected spike, right? So you're going to have some DDoS attack, or you're going to have somebody scanning, port scanning, and all of a sudden you get the spike that you really never knew could happen, and you're going to exceed your capacity. You might get lucky and that might never happen to you, but really it's something you want to think through, because the real question is equivalent of how many nines of reliability you want to pay for, right? It's going to be a risk versus cost conversation. So what you really want to do is figure out, okay, to what point are we expected to be able to support a spike or whatever the case is, and at what point do we say, all right, well, yeah, so things are going to fail, we're going to exceed capacity, that's just life. If you want to lower that risk, you're going to need to throw more money at it in terms of hardware or other options, right? Separating your worker groups. So whatever the case is. So drilling a little bit into that. And this is one of the reference architectures fresh off the presses as of last night. But this one shows the, as it's called here, the all-in-one reference architecture. And the all-in-one worker group on the left there is really what it's talking about. It does have a replay worker group already separated out, even though we're calling it all-in-one worker group. Just to illustrate the point that for something like replay, if you're going to have any sizable volume that you're trying to bring in, you really don't want to do that through your regular worker groups that are processing the data day to day. For those not particularly familiar with replay, the idea being that if you're writing out to an object store data lake of some sort, you can then decide, as I mentioned earlier, right? You're writing out full fidelity logs. Maybe they're not going to your analytics tool, right? The optimized data line there, showing that you're sending a subset. But then you realize that, oh, I need, we had back on the customer side, we had the, I'm losing the word, there goes my brain. The attack where it was in the network for a while and you had to go a few months back. So that could happen with anything, right? And I'm sure somebody knows what I'm talking about, but for some reason that word is gone now. So that's the benefit of having your full fidelity logs in the data lake, is that you can say, oh, I want to know what this IP was doing at this time because I know it was compromised. And then you can go replay those logs back into your analytics tool and be able to analyze them in the place where it makes sense. The other part here that I want to bring up and that talks about exceeding capacity is you need to really think about what happens when you exceed capacity. So we have a few different source types on the left there, going to this all-in-one worker group. And if we have a spike in one of those sources, that means less processing power is available for other sources. So let's say your, I don't know, the elastic beat source all of a sudden is getting a lot more than you expected, right? And now your throughput is at capacity or you're starting to exceed your capacity. If everything is in a single worker group, now let's say your syslog source that's coming in over UDP, all of a sudden you can't get all of that UDP off the wire fast enough because your workers are too busy processing this other spike. So that means you're going to have a negative impact of potential lost data on those sources. So that's one of the constraints of the all-in-one worker group. And in the main document, I kind of go into different scenarios. We're not going to go through all of them, but there's you could potentially in some cases run a single node, right, all-in-one deployment, where you're not separating the leader from the workers. You have one worker effectively. That might be fine in some cases if, let's say, you have all pull sources and you don't really care if they're interrupted for a little bit. But most of the time, you need to think about what will happen if one of the sources spike. What will happen if I exceed capacity? So the next
typically,
time,
for the sources that overrun, what are you typically seeing in PS engagements of causing sources to all of a sudden start overrunning?
It depends. But in terms of what we typically see, so in some cases, you might just have an undersized deployment. You didn't realize when you deployed initially how much is going to be in. Like all of a sudden, your Palo Alto logs grew by 50%, and nobody really paid attention to that increase until you started having problems and losing data. So, that's one case. The other case is not recognizing, things like this, right? Where you're actually, your capacity is just wrong because you didn't realize how spiky your inputs are. Those are the two that, that come to the top of the head. And you could also have, something down. The other one actually that came up recently is if you're running a hypervisor, right, you're running VMs, well, the hypervisor might decide to give you fewer resources than you thought you were getting, even though they were supposed to be guaranteed. So, yeah, those are often the cases. Or just any source producing more logs for whatever reason, misconfiguration and whatnot, than you expect. So one of the things that helps with that, and this is the other reference architecture that was published last night, is having separate worker groups. So this one talks about syslog, and you can kind of see the mapping. There's data center 1 going to data center 1 through load balancer, data center 2 going to data center, or X, and so on and so forth. Some of the things that this allows you to do is, first of all, if we're talking about exceeding capacity, well, if your one type of logs exceeds all of a sudden, it doesn't affect the other ones, right? So if your Palo Alto all of a sudden spike, but Cisco ASA, not necessarily you're going to have both, but whatever. Those are not going to be affected because they're in a separate worker group, separate hardware, and so on. So you can continue writing those. The caveat there is there's still a common point, which in this case is your object store data lake and the analytics tool, right? If all of a sudden your analytics tool is getting overwhelmed by the amount of data coming through one of these worker groups, you're going to have a problem with, sending out from other ones as well, potentially. So there are a lot of moving pieces that come into play here. The other thing that's alluded to by data center 1 devices and data center 1, right, is the ability to have co-location, which is one of the things called out in how to get more reliable syslog UDP, right? And these diagrams actually have a bunch of text with them if you go to the docs page that talk about those things. But if you don't want to be sending UDP over the wire between data centers, right? You want your workers as close as possible to those sources. Even if it's not syslog, in some cases, you want to have other reasons why you do it, which I have listed further in and we can dig into, but this is just one example of having multiple worker groups. And then it's worth talking about what reference means. So this is actually, was a good analogy because it turns out that when gene manufacturers make genes, they have a fit model whose name is Natasha Wagner. She is the one that they go to and try on the new genes and then tailor them to make it the right fit for her. Which means if your body shape is not exactly like Natasha Wagner's, they're not going to fit just right. And that's kind of the point here. And there's a Radiolab episode about it, which I found very fascinating. But that's what it means. The reference architectures are, well, here's an example of what might work, but really in your case, it's probably not going to be exactly that. And as I talked earlier, it's probably going to evolve over time as you are realizing things about your environment that you didn't necessarily know up front. Point being, reference architectures doesn't mean prescribed architectures. It means here are things to consider, here are things to look at, here are some options, pick what you need from it. It's not going to be a perfect fit. And well, I talked really fast, and I purposely put this slide as the last one because I could talk just as long about this one slide, which are the various reasons why you might have separate worker groups. So I'll pause for questions. And then as long as, Tony and Shawn let me, I will just keep talking about these examples.
Hi, Eugene. I have a quick question. Yeah, so if you were to back up a couple of slides to the syslog example where you have the syslog worker group, yeah, this one.
Yep.
It looks like your syslog sources are somewhat being pinned to individual worker nodes. Is that a thing? I thought you could only send to kind of a syslog, like a worker group in its entirety, and then that load is kind of split between the worker nodes inside of the group. But this one makes it look like data center 1 devices will be pinned to a certain set of worker nodes, and then data center X devices is also another set of worker nodes. But while the other nodes inside of that group are safe, is that question?
That is an excellent question, because now that I look at this diagram more, as I said, it's fresh off the presses, and I used it for that example, but I realized, yes, these are not split out into separate worker groups. You could, and in fact, my assumption without reading that little header is that these white boxes were each a separate worker group, but they're not. However, to answer your question, even if they're part of the same worker group, they could actually be in different data centers if the load balancers that decide where your data are sent. But you're right that the configuration that you push out to the worker group has to be the same. However, if you have, Palo Alto logs coming in from devices, your firewalls in one data center and another data center, yes, one worker set of workers nodes is going to get a certain, local Palo Alto logs from that device, and another data center's workers are going to get local Palo Alto logs from, within that data center, and there's no reason, unless you do want them processed differently, there's no reason why they need to be in separate worker groups. The other piece here is, yes, the white groupings are just by data center, so there are multiple nodes within that, so it's not really sending to a single node. Right, each one of those little blue boxes is a separate node, and the load balancer distributes data between those nodes.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, but yeah, that's true. Like, this is also an option. It's not the one I thought I was picking, but it illustrates the example, right? If you want the same configuration, then part of the same worker group is very reasonable. Any other questions? All right, so I will talk some more about these different bullet points, and then somebody will stop me at some point, or I'll keep talking. So we did quite a bit talk about the first one, right? Keeping your workers close to the UDP sources. So that's pretty covered. The second one talks about egress costs, right? So if you have to pay to move data out of wherever it is, right? You could have workers right there in the same region, right, where you're not paying yet to send the data over, process the data, reduce as needed, compress before sending out to another region or to on-prem or to wherever you want to send it. So if egress costs are a concern, and you have to be sending quite a bit for egress costs to start being significant enough for it to be worth to stand up another worker group. But you can do math, you can figure out if it makes sense at some point. Third one talks about the separating of the push and pull sources. So if we go back and look at this diagram here, right, you have some push sources, you have some pull sources, well, actually, you know, honestly, not necessarily, but so the pull sources example is when you're like Office 365 that I had in the previous diagram, right? Like this is your pull source. This is your pull source that's constantly spiking, that is going to, you know, sit there not using anything, and then all of a sudden use a bunch of resources. Not use anything, then all of a sudden use a bunch of resources. If that's shared with push sources, those push sources are going to be affected. Again, UDP is the most severe example, but you know, other senders are going to be affected if you're hitting capacity, or if your pull sources spike all of a sudden, right? Because all of a sudden there's something to process that's much bigger than you're normally getting. However, if your pull source worker group is undersized, it's just going to have trouble keeping up, right? So for, let's say you have, you know, the setup with 2 big worker nodes, and one of them goes down for an hour, right? And the other one is not enough to process everything that's happening. Well, with a pull source, it'll come, when it comes back, it'll start catching up and continue processing the backlog of what needs to be collected. So that's the example there, is if you keep your push sources separate from your pull sources, which is pretty standard and recommended unless you have very small amounts of data, then you're going to protect your push sources, which are more sensitive to overload, from your pull sources. Next one is if you can't have certain types of data or leave a certain region. So GDPR, an example, right? You need to keep your European user data on the European servers. You might want to send something out, anonymize some, you know, statistics outside of there, but your worker group that's processing those types of data is going to be in that location. The next one is talking about the reducing or increasing number of workers connecting to a source of destination. So actually, one of the customers I'm working with, they have an issue that they're writing to Azure Blob storage, but they're ending up with files that are too small because they have a lot of worker processes processing things in parallel. And as they're writing the files, each worker process is writing its own file and then sends it out. So you're effectively multiplying the number of worker processes by the number of files you're writing out. So if you had half the number of worker processes, you would have bigger files, and in some cases that matters depending how they're consumed. So an approach there might be to have a smaller worker group that's responsible for communicating with a destination. That's then, you know, the other worker groups are forwarding to as needed, but it's doing the output. Similar setup where you want, all right, interacting with external systems like Redis lookups. If you want fewer worker processes doing that communication, you could pipe things through another worker group, right, depending on the number of connections you want, right? So if there's caching going on of some sort, you might not want to have that cache on every single worker process, or rather, you will have that cache on every single worker process potentially, but you want to have fewer of them, so, you know, for memory concerns or whatever. And lastly, this has actually improved, I believe, with one of the recent releases. But there was a case where whenever you're deploying to Kafka-based sources, like Event Hub sources, it ends up triggering rebalancing because of the consumers leaving the group and then rejoining. So that's an approach where if you have that worker group separately and don't have to deploy to it as frequently, We just refactored that when one of the customers that I had, we moved out the Enterprise Hub consumers into their own worker group, and that gets changed once in a while, not as frequently as the worker group that's actually processing the data and formatting it and sending it out elsewhere. So that would be another example of why you might want a worker group. And this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of imagination. These are just ideas, as is the rest of the document, just things to think about as you are looking at your deployment. And that's about it, but I'm happy to keep talking about other things. Any other questions, thoughts, other things people have seen in the field that's not covered? I know I didn't cover everything, but other ones that stand out to you as, oh yeah, I needed a separate worker group, or the sizing needed to take into account something.
I guess you covered it all.
That's it. I'm done. The it depends no longer depends on anything. No,
that's right. And you've done a presentation on this before. There's a link you had that we could probably share out there that for that particular presentation. You did only a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it? It wasn't that long ago.
So we had a couple of live streams with Ed Bailey, just talking about a lot of the thought that this is similar content that went into these documents, and looking at some of the examples of why separate worker groups, different types of sources, and so on. So yes,
we did have Hillary post something out there saying that they've seen a need for a separate worker group for doing replays to speed those up. That kind of makes sense, to do a separate worker group for replay if you can anyway.
Yes, for sure. That was well, I stopped sharing, but I can share back out. That's exactly why, even on the yeah, let me share it back out. On that first one, right?
Yep.
Yes, it's an own one worker group, but replay is its own separate group because exactly that point, Hillary. Yep. So the thing to keep in mind there is, as you're running your replay, you're still sending it to an analytics tool. So that load on the downstream systems is something to keep in mind. But yeah, separate replay worker group is very highly recommended unless you're dealing with very small volumes of replay. Now, and there's the little note there, which we can get into a little bit, right? It says they can be Linux servers or a Kubernetes pod for the replay worker groups. That's one of the use cases that's talked about for autoscaling in Kubernetes, is if you have a replay worker group that normally doesn't need anything, doesn't need to do anything, is just sitting there. So you just have it sitting there with a single node, right, with a single pod. And then when it needs more data to process, it'll go and do the discovery and say, oh, I have 2 terabytes of data to pull back and replay. It's going to start spinning up and auto-scaling additional workers so that it can handle that data. And then once it's done, they're going to come back down. Now, it's simple to say. You do want to make sure you kind of look at all the different things that go into it. So auto-scaling is not, out of the box, easy, just turn it on and done. You have to think about various things, like making sure that you are scaling in the right factors, right? 50% CPU maybe is not the right answer. Maybe you want 75% CPU. Maybe it's not busy enough yet. Maybe, depending on what you're doing, memory is important. The other thing to keep in mind is, well, if you're going to have these workers going away, if there's anything sitting in their persistent queue, for example, and if you have persistent queue configured, you got to make sure, right, and you're using Kubernetes, you got to make sure you got your fast disks and that they're not going to drop off. But you're also going to think about, yes, if you're going to put a big load on the downstream system, maybe persistent queues is in fact going to engage. And then if your worker is gone, there's nothing looking at that persistent queue. So you might be losing something there. So, okay, I see Hillary saying they're using Kubernetes. So yeah, definitely lots of considerations there related to that, which we're not digging into here, but yes, you have to know what you're doing with Kubernetes. It's great, but you have to know what you're doing. So
cool. Looks like Mike put your last live streams back out there that you were talking about. So we got links there. So if anybody wants to grab those from the chat, they can do that. Anybody else have any questions that you want to ask before we continue on? And don't be afraid to speak up. It's okay. Using chat's good, but we like to hear you. I'll take that as we're done with that. Eugene, thank you so much for that. I didn't get to catch the other live streams when you did it. So this was a good overview. I appreciate it.
the other one has Ed, so it's more interactive.
I got you. Yeah. No Ed, so that's good. Understand. All right, Tony, you said you had some information maybe about Cribl University you wanted to share.
Yeah, I got a couple nuggets here. So Cribl University, and I'll go ahead and share. Just we're hot off the press with a lot of things right now. We have some new items in our catalog with advanced troubleshooting. So we have different topics here to help you make sure that you're able to continue on your learning journey. So the advanced troubleshooting, and then also we have the Criblets for standard troubleshooting, which a lot of troubleshooting, attaching workers, and SSO into your stream. So we want to make sure that you still get the best out of your using Cribl, and of course, Cribl University. It's free. So some new items for people to be able to get in and make sure that they're staying up to date. Then besides Cribl University, CriblCon. So we're having CriblCon again this year. We're expanding it. We're going to meet July 17th at the Mirage in Vegas. And this time it's not just a party. We actually are having some sessions. So some hands-on labs, some sessions. So you get to actually hang out with us all day on Monday if that's what you want. Otherwise, we do still have our party. But we'll be available to talk with you on Monday and throughout the week starting on July 17th.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. Hopefully I'm able to attend. I think I will be able to. So looking forward to that. All right. You also have some in real life Cribl user groups coming up too. You got one today, don't you, somewhere?
Yeah, we have was it Dallas today? I think it's Dallas today. Right. So we've started rolling out Cribl in real life, and it's been great. I actually got to attend the St. Louis meeting, and it was fun to actually get back in touch and actually meet people that I've been talking with online. I know we've had kind of the Midwest representing. We've had a couple in Texas, or one in Texas in San Antonio, the St. Louis, and then a couple other ones that are still coming up. So we're starting to launch that out. If you go to the events page, cribl.io/events, you'll be able to see where we're at and where we're upcoming. And then of course I put them on the community calendar for any of the in real life sessions that are coming up. So calendar has the global user group and then anything that is the in real life sessions coming up.
Cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to an Atlanta one soon, so hopefully we'll be able to get that.
Should we get that?
We do have an Atlanta event going on this Friday, but I'm not sure if it's still open yet. But it was there's a March Madness watch party in the Atlanta area with SentinelOne and Cloudflare with Cribl as well that I'm going to. But that's from 11:30 to 3 p.m. Should be a fun time. This Punch Bowl Social is a really cool place in Atlanta. Like I said, a lot of you aren't from there, so it's right around where the Atlanta Braves play baseball, and it's a really cool event. I've done an event there before, so definitely looking forward to that. I'll count that as our real life event, even though it's not a official user group meeting, but that'll be cool. So if anybody is from that area and wants to go, and I can send the link to you and see if you can still register. So it'll be fun.
One more note, thanks Aaron for reminding me. If you are looking to put in a talk for the CriblCon, because we do have the call for papers open right now, it doesn't have to be 100% ready to go. We'll help you with your talk, help make sure that it's fully fleshed out, help you with your speaking. We're here to help you be successful. So if you're putting in a talk, just let us know, and myself or anyone from the advocacy team can definitely help you out and make sure that it's good to go.
Excellent. All right. Anybody else have any other announcements that we might need to cover before we start wrapping things up? All right. Well, I guess that wraps things up. Appreciate you letting me be the guest host for this month. And I know that Rich will probably be back next time, but more than happy to fill in anytime it's needed. So, but thanks everybody for joining, and hope you'll have a great rest of the week.